48 out of 50 states have legalized some form of gambling, whether that be at casinos, online sports betting platforms, or state-run lotteries. Proponents say that legalized gambling has created great economic development, whereas opponents say that that economic development has been built on the backs of the poor. Not to mention that legalized gambling has fostered all kinds of other social ailments. Today, we are going to be looking at the recent history of legalized gambling and figure out, should it be legal? I'm Julie Hartman, and this is Timeless. Hey everyone, welcome to Timeless. I hope that you are having a great week. Just a reminder to hit the subscribe button down below so that you can get notified every time I post a new video, and be sure to follow me on Instagram and Twitter at Julie R. Hartman. So today we are talking about gambling. You know that I love to explore random subjects that I find to be interesting, but there actually is a story behind this one that piqued my interest in this subject. Those of you who listen to Dennis and Julie may already know this story, but recently, actually last month, I went to my first ever speech in another state, and that was the state of Washington. They were so nice. They flew me out there, put me up in a hotel, and I spoke at this Lincoln Day gala event, which was really just a fun experience. I am someone, though, who likes to get to places extremely early. If I'm not really early, I'm late. This was true when I was playing water polo, when I was swimming. I was the type of person that was standing by the block to swim 5 or 10 events before that I was slated to go up. And it's no different when I travel. So even though my speech was late at night, I showed up to the hotel in Washington actually quite early in the morning, and I was staying at a casino on a Native American reservation. It was called the Lumi Reservation, and I forget what the name of the casino was that I was staying at. So I go to the front desk. It's about 10 a.m. Again, the speech isn't until nighttime. And I ask if I can check into my room. The people look at me and they just laugh in my face. They're like, oh, right, it's 10 a.m. and you think you can check into your room now. Come back to us at 3 o'clock. I'm in the middle of Washington State. I don't know anyone in Washington State. I don't know what I'm going to do for the next 6 hours, but I'm staying at a casino resort, so I decided to go gamble away all my money. No, just kidding. That's not what I decided to do, though that would be a fun end to the story, I guess. I actually decided to just go people watch in the casino. I had never been inside a casino for a long period of time. Maybe that makes me sheltered. I don't know, but it's just the truth. And so I went there. Again, it's 10 a.m. on a Friday, and I was just stunned as to what I was seeing. There were so many people playing on these slot machines. I was also overwhelmed by the colors and the sounds of all of the machines. I could see how intoxicating it was. It is the Silver Reef Casino. OMG, Shanzi. I don't know whether to call you a stalker or a great producer, researcher. He says, I get around. It was the Silver Reef Casino. So many colors, so many lights, so many sounds. Of course, there's alcohol everywhere. And there are these people at 10 a.m. on a Friday who are gambling. So I just sat there for hours and made it my business to people watch. From there, I ordered this book called All In, which is a fabulous book on gambling. It explores the recent history, which I'm about to go into. And I have really come to understand both sides of the argument. That is, people who think that legalization is a good thing and those who say that it is a bad thing. So why don't we go into some of these arguments here? But first, what is gambling? Gambling is betting on something of value in a game of chance. Sometimes those games require skill, like blackjack and poker. Other times they require absolutely no skill at all, just sheer luck. That's the case with a scratch-off lottery ticket or if you're playing bingo. And a lot of the times it's both, where sometimes you have to have a little bit of skill, but you're also relying on a little bit of luck. That's certainly even the case in games that rely a lot on skills, such as the aforementioned poker and blackjack. So it involves risk, misfortune, and calculation. That is the definition of gambling. And no wonder it is so fun for people, People love to take risks. It's such a great thing for adrenaline junkies and even non-adrenaline junkies. People who are just looking to suffuse a moment in their lives with fun and drama. So where do you gamble? You can gamble on your phone with the newly legalized sports betting platforms, which we are going to get into a little bit in this episode. Of course, you can bet in informal settings like a church. A lot of churches actually host low-level gambling by bingo and other... Sean just yelled, bingo! He's just in the business of distracting me as I'm trying to do this show. Yeah, that's right. Churches hold bingo. At the gas station, you can even gamble by buying a lottery ticket. And then, of course, you can gamble in casinos. So as I mentioned in the introduction, 48 out of 50 U.S. states allow gambling in some form. What are the 2 states that don't allow it? Can you guess? Utah is number 1. That should be an easy guess because Utah is very strict when it comes to fun activities. That probably made me sound like I was throwing shade on Utah, and maybe I am a little bit. When I was there recently, actually, I learned that you are only allowed to have 1 shot of tequila per margarita drink because there are all these laws pertaining to not getting too intoxicated. And of course, those laws have bled over into gambling. So no gambling in Utah. It's obviously because the state legislature is overwhelmingly Mormon, very socially conservative. The other state, this one surprised me, Hawaii. Hawaii doesn't allow any state lotteries, no sports betting, no casinos. Why? It's not for religious reasons as it is in Utah. It's actually because they don't want their tourists to come and gamble. The whole point of Hawaii is to be outside and to surf and to be on the beach and go hiking. They want to preserve that magical experience for tourists, and they think that gambling will take away from the aura of Hawaii. I gotta say, I think they're right about that. I respect their decisions. If you look at casinos, though, 48 out of 50 states allow casino gambling in one form. Now, sometimes it's not land-based commercial casinos. Sometimes only riverboat casinos are allowed or only on tribal land. There was a Supreme Court indecision in the 1980s that said that casinos that are run on tribal land are not under the jurisdiction of the federal government. So some of the casinos in states are in these sequestered places, but in many other states, you can just drive down the street and you will see a commercial casino. On average, annually, Americans gamble $55 billion at casinos alone. And I haven't even gotten to sports betting or lotteries. Think about that, $55 billion with a B dollars. Holy moly. Now let's go on to sports betting. Sports betting was illegal in the United States until 2018 when the Supreme Court struck down a federal law prohibiting sports gambling. And so now all of these sports betting sites, what are they called? FanDuel and Knights something. My male producers are nodding. You can see how much I know about the sports betting world. Those have proliferated. DraftKings, thank you, DraftKings. Those have proliferated. 36 states and Washington, D.C. have legalized sports betting. And as of 2022, $100 billion was gambled on sports betting platforms just in that 1 year alone, okay? So now we're up to close to $200 billion of money between casinos and sports betting. Now let's look at lotteries. 45 states in the District of Columbia have lotteries. In 2022, Americans spent over $105 billion on lottery tickets. So now we're up to $300 billion. Those of you who are watching are probably thinking, of course, great reason for why gambling should be legal. Look at all this revenue that is accumulated. Well, as we'll get into later, a lot of that revenue is built on the backs of overwhelmingly low-income minority individuals. This is because it makes sense when you don't have a high income, you think that one of the ways that you may be able to change your luck is by gambling. But unfortunately, 99.999% of the time, you're only going to end up losing money, not gaining money. But let's go back into the history. Actually, gambling was quite common during the 13 colonies. In fact, many of the public schools and even private universities, such as Princeton University and Rutgers University, were built off of lotteries. It was a great way for people to make money. So in all of the 13 colonies, lotteries were legal. In fact, one of the incidents, of course not the incident, but one of them that led to the colonies really taking umbrage with the British Crown was that in 1769, the British Crown put a restrictions on state lotteries. That, alongside the stamp tax, the Intolerable Acts, all of the restrictions, that was just another penny in the jar, if you will. A straw that broke the camel's back that led to the colonists revolting and establishing the United States of America. So after the American Revolution, gambling more or less proliferated. As with just about any vice, people are always going to do it. That was no different, even back in the Puritan, super religious 17th and 18th centuries. But by the turn of the 20th century, or excuse me, the 19th century to the 20th century, gambling was actually on the decline in the United States. Kentucky and Maryland banned betting on horse races, and even the state of Nevada, home of Sin City, had a prohibition on commercial gambling. There were three main developments that I can identify in my extensive research that changed this situation. They are riveting. The first is crime and corruption. When I was reading this, I couldn't help but think about how this argument, that is that gambling creates a lot of crime and corruption, and then you legalize it to outroot that crime and corruption, that bears a lot of resemblance to a line of thought that goes, well, students are going to cheat on the test anyway, so why don't you just make it an open book exam? You can't help but ponder, is that really the best way to go about a situation of corruption? Do you clamp down harder on the corruption so as to eliminate it, or do you legalize the thing that is causing the corruption, which also sort of has a way of eliminating it? It's a tricky one. Between 1894 and 1972, there were 4 major investigations into police corruption in the New York Police Department alone. This was pertaining to NYPD officers getting pay cuts. This is what they called the pad, getting pay cuts from mob bosses and other gamblers in order to not prosecute those mob bosses and gamblers. This was also during the time of Prohibition. In 1920, the 18th Amendment was passed, which completely eliminated and prohibited alcohol and gambling from being legal. So you can see that it created this ample opportunity for corruption. Crime bosses such as Harry Gross were running these really popular underground gambling houses. There was a lot of drinking, a lot of drugs, a lot of prostitution, all of the vices that come alongside gambling. And gambling activates the same part of your brain as drugs. And it can give you the potential to make a lot of money. And so it made the crime bosses a lot of money because people would gamble their salaries away, and then those crime bosses would have ample cash to pay off the NYPD officers. So a lot of the things that we know now associated with police departments actually came from this history of gambling. The first example is police unions. One of the first police unions, the Patrolmen's Benevolent Association, or the PBA, was founded in 1894, just 2 years after that first investigation into corruption with the NYPD happened. Now, this police union was formed primarily to advocate that police officers get higher salaries. The argument went, if you just paid police officers better, they wouldn't need to get a pay cut from crime bosses. So again, this gambling issue actually contributed to some of the institutional bedrocks of policing that we see now. So what happened was, throughout the 20th century, the 19th century. Nope, the 20th century. Gosh, why did they do that? Why do they put it one ahead? It's so confusing. The 1900s. During the 1900s or the 20th century, people in New York divided into 2 groups: pro-gambling legalization and anti-gambling legalization. And it really became a frenzy. Mayors of New York City had to resign. Police commissioners actually shot themselves or jumped from high buildings because they were embattled in public scandals. Thousands of police officers, both in plainclothes uniforms and also in actual uniforms, had to retire or be fired. And it was a really, again, big divide. Some other police captains were very strict and said that none of this, even toying around with the idea of gambling, could be allowed to happen. Mayor LaGuardia, of course, named after LaGuardia Airport, or LaGuardia Airport is named after this mayor, he actually dumped illegal slot machines into the harbor in New York City. He was one of those hardline mayors. But then, during a few years after Mayor LaGuardia dumped all of those illegal slot machines into the harbor, there was a funeral of a captain of the NYPD 68th precinct. This was Captain John Flynn in 1950. He shot himself, very sadly, because he was embattled in one of these gambling scandals. And 6,000 NYPD officers showed up to his funeral in New York City. This was a silent protest. They were protesting against the fact that this captain shot himself because he was caught up in this scandal that many of these officers didn't think needed to happen if gambling was legalized. This was actually, and continues to this date, to stand as the largest police funeral ever held in New York City. It was a protest against gambling restrictions. Another development paradoxically contributed to the legalization of gambling, at least in New York, and then subsequently elsewhere. There was a Democrat senator in the 1950s named Estes Kefauver, and he launched the Senate Committee to Investigate Organized Crime in Interstate Commerce. He was the first senator to do a large-scale look at the mob, not just in the Northeast, but all around the country. Who were members of the mafia? Where were they? What were they doing? And these were televised hearings. This was the beginning of the politics as theater mentality that we have today, where you can just click on the screen and see the January 6th hearings or see the weaponization of government hearings. And instead of politicians doing this silently and dutifully, it's become theater. This was true of this investigation into the mob bosses. And of course, because it was an investigation into the mob, it was all the more entertaining for people. Tens of millions of Americans watched this on their screens. This occurred, there were 14 hearings from 1950 to 1952 that were televised. And it was the first time that most Americans even heard of the term mob or mafia. And it exposed the tie between underground gambling and the mob. And the reason why I started this off by saying paradoxically is exposing this corruption actually lent more of a hand to those who were proponents of legalization. They said, legalize gambling, get the control and the money out of the hands of the mob bosses, and give it to everyday business people who can make money for their state and for the United States of America. So in the 1970s, the tide started to turn. New York State legalized gambling after one of the heads of the New York Police Department in 1972, who was the commissioner, Patrick V. Murphy, he came out and said that the NYPD was changing their strategy with regard to gambling. He said that they were going to de-emphasize, quote, the unenforceable and publicly unpopular gambling laws. The reason why he said they were doing this was to, quote, reduce the opportunities for police corruption. So in 1972, when the NYPD basically said, we're not going to do this anymore, we're not going to go after people who are gambling, that is what set in motion the legalization in the state and in many other states. So that's the first big development. Crime and corruption, paradoxically, leading to legalization. I'll give another example pertaining to sports. In 1919, there was what was called the Black Sox scandal, where the Chicago White Sox, 8 members of that team were paid off by some members of the mob to hand over the World Series to the Cincinnati Reds. This is because the Chicago White Sox were heavily favored to win the World Series, all of these mob bosses wanted others to bet on the fact that the White Sox were going to win the World Series. Then the mob bosses paid off the players so that they would lose, and so the mob bosses would get all the money. This changed a lot about Major League Baseball. Actually, it led to the first Major League Baseball commissioner being hired in 1920 in the wake of this catastrophic gambling scandal. But again, it also led to the legalization of sports betting in order to get rid of the mob's control of this industry. Another big contributor to the legalization of gambling in the United States, of course, you guessed it, Las Vegas, Sin City. Sin City, though, 100 years ago, was a desert with almost nothing except for those weird things that you see in Western movies, those like patches of grass or grain that float and roll around in the wind. It was a desolate city, and the state of Nevada and Las Vegas needed to figure out what they could do to industrialize this desert land. And so they turned to casinos and gambling. Now, Las Vegas was already gaining a reputation in the early 1900s of being Sin City, a place where people could let their vices run wild, a place where they could go and get a break or a lack of judgment with regard to some of their lifestyle decisions. For instance, Las Vegas had and continues to have the easiest requirement for divorce, only 6 weeks requirement of residential status in order to terminate a marriage. On the flip side of that, Las Vegas also happens to be one of the places with the easiest requirements, not just to get a divorce, but to also get married. You can have instant marriages in all of these little chapels on the Strip in Las Vegas. And so given that the groundwork was already there for Las Vegas to be Sin City, they kind of kicked it over the edge. Nevada in 1931 was one of the first states in the union to allow, quote, wide open commercial gambling. 20 years earlier, though, in 1911, the Las Vegas Chamber of Commerce was formed. Now, states' chambers of commerce today tend to do a lot to support tourist activities in that state. That was not always the case. A lot of the times, the chambers of commerce, their job was to, regulate commerce, not to attract tourism. Las Vegas was the progenitor, was the leader of states' chambers of commerce, essentially being these PR machines that attract tourism. Unlike any other chambers of commerce that existed in the United States, the Las Vegas one, when formed in 1911, was a PR machine. It hired a news bureau. It had its own news bureau department, actually. It retained an advertising firm that helped them build billboards around the country, put freeway signs near Nevada, encouraging people to get off the exit and go over to Las Vegas. They put out all of these pamphlets. They encouraged Hollywood screenmakers and actors and actresses to create movies around Nevada. And they gave it this idea that Nevada was a resort place. Hoover Dam was nearby, Lake Mead, there were swimming pools. A lot of people, Americans at the time, didn't have swimming pools in their backyards. You can see from the poster that we have up here, there's a man and a woman looking quite into each other. It's a place for love and sex and prostitution. That was the branding PR strategy of Las Vegas from the very beginning. And interestingly, organized crime built Las Vegas. When Las Vegas legalized wide open commercial casino gambling in 1931, a lot of the early builders of casinos were mob bosses, were the mafia. Why? A, because they had the money, and B, because banks and other investors did not feel comfortable investing their money in casinos because they viewed it as a dirty business. They didn't want to get embattled in that, just in case people would screw them over. And also, there was no guarantee that legalized gambling was going to remain legal. People had seen it over the 200-year history of the United States seesaw. It was legal in the 13 colonies, then it wasn't. And sometimes throughout the 1800s, it was legal, then it wasn't. At the beginning of the turn of the century, Louisiana and Maryland got rid of horse races and they brought them back. It was like a yo-yo seesaw kind of legalization, not legalization, and so people didn't want to do that. So a lot of the casinos were built off of the mob, though, of course, as those casinos became more popular, it attracted people who were not part of professional organized crime, such as the Hilton brothers, which were some of the earliest hotel magnates to come to the Las Vegas Strip and build these casinos. I read a primary source from the New York Times in the 1950s that was talking about the popularity of Las Vegas, and I think it really well synopsized the way that Americans view gambling. This reporter said that Americans like Las Vegas because they have this desire to gamble, but they don't want casinos and gambling to be in their own communities. They would much rather travel, go to this haven. It's almost like another universe where they get to tap out of life, get to tap out of their otherwise strictly held moral standards and go to Sin City and let their vices run wild. But they didn't want to go back home and see a casino on the same block as their child's schools. And this is why, even in the United States today in 2023, a lot of casinos are in sequestered areas of the state or of the country. Look at Atlantic City in New Jersey. It's right there on the edge of the state. It's on an island. A lot of casinos in California are sort of bundled together in areas of town. In other words, they're not spread out and just on every street corner. People want them, but they don't want them always in your face. And finally, I said there were three main developments. The first was crime and corruption that contributed to legalized gambling. The second was the proliferation of Las Vegas, the PR machine of it is Sin City. And the third, that really overwhelmingly contributed to legalizing gambling, was economic downturn. Let's look at the state of New Jersey. In the 1960s, New Jersey had notoriously bad public infrastructure, as well as really decrepit public schools. 50,000 New Jersey American public school children were going to school in what would be considered inadequate facilities. So what did they do? Well, New Jersey legislators started to advocate for a state lottery. And they positioned this as, this is going to raise money for the state of New Jersey without raising any taxes for the American people. That's perfect. They viewed it as a total win-win. Also, the legislators of New Jersey noted that approximately 25% of lottery sales in New York State were purchased by New Jersey citizens. Why not bring some of that revenue to the state of New Jersey? And also, as always with legal gambling arguments, there was the crime argument. Americans in the 1960s annually were spending about $5 billion in illegal gambling. Also, as the Kefauver Committee reported, the mafia was very much tied up with gambling. Also, the mafia was especially present in the state of New Jersey. And also, there was an argument pertaining to race, that overwhelmingly low-income minority communities were the ones where people were arrested for gambling. For instance, in 1969, 66% of gambling arrests in New Jersey were of Black people. So there was this idea, make that money go to schools instead of the mob. Make people who are doing something illegally, make them be allowed to do it legally. That was the argument for. The argument against was, there is no such thing as raising money without raising taxes. Yes, maybe technically a lottery raises money without raising taxes, but the lottery is called the poor man's tax for a reason, because you are still spending money. You're handing over your income to the state. Maybe it's not on your W-9 IRS form, but it's at the gas station when you're scratching off a lottery ticket and you don't win the lottery and you just handed over $100 to your government. It's the same thing. You're being taxed. Another argument was that legalizing lotteries would undermine the American work ethic. People in New Jersey, not just in New Jersey, I'm just focusing on this one state because there was this debate that was very public in the 60s, but all around the country, people were saying, if we legalize casinos and lotteries and sports betting, people are going to get the idea that the way that they make money and support their families is through luck and through irresponsible activity. In other words, they don't have to work hard in order to earn a salary. And they argued that legalizing gambling was pushing some of these bad social ideas onto the most vulnerable people. And they say that though legalized gambling may eliminate some crime by taking away the prevalence of the mob and the mafia, it will lead to other attendant crimes such as drug and alcohol abuse, violence, brawls in the casino, which can lead to misdemeanors, etc. So it would just replace crimes instead of eliminating crimes. Well, the people of New Jersey didn't buy it. In 1969, there was a referendum in which 1.9 million people voted to legalize the state lottery. Only 350,000 opposed it. And right then and there, New Jersey adopted a lottery. It spread like wildfire. After New Jersey adopted it, most of the Northeast, within just a few years, adopted it. Massachusetts, Vermont, Virginia, Rhode Island, even on our side of the country, in California and Arizona, they actually were in contact with New Jersey state legislators and asked them how they ran their lottery. And a lot of other lotteries throughout the country are modeled off of the New Jersey lottery. And of course, another development, maybe as like a small number 4, which sealed the deal of the legalization of gambling, was that Supreme Court case that I mentioned in 1987, which found that gambling activities conducted on tribal lands did not fall within the legal jurisdiction of the state where the tribal land is. And so essentially tribal lands can open casinos and do whatever form of gambling they want, with, of course, some restrictions by state laws. But that just opened the door for legalized gambling. So now that we know this history, let's look a little bit about how this has panned out. And I would like to tell you, because I don't believe in hiding an agenda or an opinion, in my assessment from my research, I have come to see that legalized gambling has probably produced more harmful effects than beneficial effects. Though, as I said at the beginning, I recognize both sides. How has this panned out? Well, one major advantage, which we cannot deny, is that it has really decreased the prevalence and the power of organized crime. Also, an enormous amount of revenue has been generated as a result of the gambling industry. There is no doubt about that. Casino owners have gotten rich. Casino managers have gotten rich. Also, casinos employ people. They employ people at the front desk. They employ people at restaurants. They employ people who are running the blackjack and the poker games. There are also these contingent businesses that pop up around casinos, restaurants, convenience stores, gas stations. Of course, it has contributed to growing the economies of any state where casinos exist. But at what cost? And on whose backs has this economic benefit been built? The answer is the poor. According to the University at Buffalo Research Institute on Addictions, low-income household, those who make $30,000 or less a year, have a 100% higher rate of gambling than those who make over $100,000 a year. As I mentioned earlier, it makes sense. When you are low income and you see the opportunity that you may just get lucky and win the lottery ticket, of course, you feel incentivized to do that. But it almost always doesn't work out and just leads into individuals losing more and more money, which creates this vicious cycle, because the more that you lose money, the more that you gamble, because the more that you really need to win a large sum of money back. I'll give another example. It's really staggering. According to this Christian Science Monitor, 80% of money lost on American casinos, on average, comes from those earning less than $50,000 a year. So maybe these casino managers are getting super rich, but they're getting the money from the poor people. Talk about a transfer of wealth from the poor to the rich. Gambling in casinos is the #1 way of doing that. Also, these casinos build in an advantage for themselves. They make it even harder for poor people to win money. This is what is called the house advantage. Let's look at a blackjack board. In blackjack, you bet on colors. There are 38 spaces on a blackjack board, 18 red, 18 black. But the casino adds in 2 green spaces, which are essentially spaces that they win. So if you are betting on the red spaces, you have an 18 out of 38 chance of winning, but you have a 20 out of 38 percent chance of losing because of those 2 green spaces which are working against you. So Oh, I meant roulette. Oops, I don't gamble. Give me some mercy, my dear. Thank you. Yes, I said blackjack. It is roulette. Same thing with lotteries. The state builds in an advantage. The state of California doesn't gamble. They just let you gamble. They build in an advantage by the fact that only one person a year wins. And so they always have more people to buy lottery tickets, and they raise more money than the money that they will have to pay out to the winner. Even if you look at sports betting, those sports betting sites that my producers seem to know, FanDuel, DraftKings, they build in an advantage by charging people fees. Gambling, really most of the time, just doesn't work out the way that you think it will. 80% of the time, on average, people lose money. Finally, just kidding. I want to read you one more stat. Crime. Another thing. In addition, some people say that legalizing gambling will get rid of crime. It substitutes the crime. The U.S. Department of Justice even affirms this. Quote, nearly 1/3 of arrestees in Las Vegas and Des Moines identified as pathological gamblers. They admitted having committed robbery in the previous year. That's 1/3 of all the arrests. Approximately 13% also said that they had assaulted someone for some money. Pathological gamblers, this is according to the U.S. Department of Justice, were much more likely to have sold illegal drugs than other arrestees. It makes sense. People get into a situation where they're desperate, they are trying to get other money, so they sell drugs or they buy drugs. And of course, when people are frustrated, it leads to more violence. So the crime argument isn't really that legitimate or that compelling, at least to me, because the crime just gets replaced. Now, the final thing that I'll say is pertaining to a totally different line of argument. We've talked about crime, we've talked about economics. Let's just talk about culture here for a minute. Sports betting. Sports betting seems harmless and great, right? Well, not really. A lot of the reason why sports have been so good for American society is that it has created a filial connection among citizens. You can be up in the stands rooting for the Dodgers, though don't root for the Dodgers because they're inviting this terrible anti-Catholic drag queen group to their home game to celebrate Pride. But in another universe where the Dodgers aren't woke, you would be in the stands celebrating the Dodgers, and you're next to a complete stranger, and you hug that stranger as if that guy is your brother because you both are fans of this team. It's a great family activity. It's a way to foster connections across different socioeconomic lines, etc. What sports gambling does is it fragments and it disaggregates the audience. People are no longer interested in the game. They're no longer interested in the Dodgers winning and whoever the heck's losing. They're interested in their specific stake that they have in the game. People now bet on the most minutia things in sports betting. They bet on the spread. How much will a team win by? How many points? How many free throws will this player make? How many fouls will that player initiate on another person? I mean, there are literally things that you can bet on how many times LeBron James scratches his nose. No longer are people coming or who will win the coin toss. Yes, Sean, thank you. Another good example. Just these small things. And it fragments us. Instead of having us all come together rooting for one team, we're rooting for how many times LeBron James scratches his nose. It's just another way of American people becoming polarized from one another, becoming fragmented, when really we should be encouraging and fostering situations and activities like sports that create unity instead of pulling it apart. I hope that you enjoyed this today. I cannot more highly recommend this book, All In. It was so interesting. I've also watched so many documentaries on gambling and read other books as preparation for this segment. You can email me at julie@julie-hartman.com if you want more information. And let me know what you think. Should gambling be legal? I don't know. Tell me in the comments section down below. Take care, everyone. See you soon.